Well, I'm grateful for that kind introduction and very pleased to be here with you all today. I believe that Ohio Dominican's theme for the academic year 2017-2018 is the common good. Now, I take the common good to be something for which everyone should strive as far as they can. I also presume that rulers and legislators are especially obliged to aim for the common good. They are especially obliged to do this because their range of influence is the greatest in human societies. Now, if I'm right to think that, you might wonder whether God, more powerful than any human ruler, whether God should strive to ensure the common good in the sense that people do. You might wonder that. And you might worry that God does not seem to be doing this. For plenty of people and other things appear to be in a bad way. There is a great deal of suffering around. There is also a great deal of moral wickedness. So, would you not expect God to put an end to all of this? Now, that question is one way of raising what is commonly called the philosophical problem of evil. And it's a problem that Christian thinkers have reflected on for centuries. One Christian who reflected on it was Thomas Aquinas. And I'm now going to say something about his take on the problem, since, in my view, Aquinas talked a great deal of sense concerning it. If my report on Aquinas is correct, though, you'll see that although Aquinas holds that everything good comes from God, he does not think that it follows that God is obliged to act for the common good in ways that one might expect politicians to do. You will see that Aquinas, in a most serious sense, does not take God to belong to a community of agents acting with an eye on what it is morally right for them to do. Now, today I'm not going to try to evaluate this position of Aquinas, though I happen to agree with it, nor am I going to talk about what Aquinas thinks about God and evil in the light of what he takes to be Christian revelation, as opposed to philosophical reflection. Trying to do that would leave me having to speak for more time than I have. So roughly what I'm going to do is try to explain to you Aquinas' take on the topic of God and evil and leave you to think about it for yourselves, and if there's any chance at all today or tomorrow to discuss it with me. So to start with, I should note that the Latin word for evil is malum. And by this word, malum, evil, Aquinas means badness of any kind at all. And Aquinas recognized that one might take this to be an intellectual problem for those who believe that God exists. There was a handout distributed before this lecture began with some quotations on it, so may I now refer you to the first quotation on the handout. You will see from this quotation that Aquinas recognizes that there is what you might call a philosophical problem of evil. He writes, "It seems that there is no God, for if one of two contraries were infinite, the other would be completely destroyed. But by the word God, we understand a certain infinite good. So if God existed, nobody would ever encounter evil. But we do encounter evil in the world, so God does not exist. Now, Aquinas doesn't agree with that argument, but how does he deal with it? The point I want to stress, mostly today, is that he does not try to deal with this argument in the way that philosophers who believe that God exists typically do so today. By this, I mean that Aquinas does not engage in theodicy, Theodicy, theodicy. By theodicy, I mean an attempt to show that God can be morally justified for permitting evil, morally justified for permitting evil. Proponents of theodicy typically try to do what John Milton said that he was up to in Paradise Lost. Milton says his aim in that work is, quote, to assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Theodicists typically proceed as if they were counsel for the defense in a legal trial. They take their client to be God, and since it seems obvious that there has been a lot of evil around, they concede that there is apparent evidence against their client. Yet, they deny that God should be convicted of being badly behaved. The evidence, they claim, is only apparent. God, says the theodicist, has impeccable moral reasons for permitting evil, reasons that should leave us concluding that God is both all-powerful and morally good, even though evil is a fact of life. Yet, as I've said, Aquinas does not engage in theodicy. I think that he has various reasons for not doing so, but chief among them is his view that God should not be thought of as a moral agent in the first place, meaning that God should not be thought of as something either morally good or morally bad. But if Aquinas thinks that, what can be his take on God and evil? Now, in turning to this question, I need to say something about what Aquinas thinks concerning God in general. And the first thing I should note is that Aquinas maintains that we do not know what God is. He's quite emphatic. We do not know what God is. Aquinas repeatedly says that this is so. And we need to be clear that when he does that, he's not just paying pious lip service to some vague idea that God is mysterious. His point is that God is strictly non-classifiable, that God belongs to no genus or species, that God is not an individual belonging to a kind of which there could be more than one member, that God is not, so we might put it, a being among beings. God, says Aquinas, is non-composite or entirely simple. God, he argues, is not something with distinct properties or attributes, as are things in the world. According to Aquinas, God and God's very nature are one and the same thing, meaning that all that is in God is God. Aquinas also maintains that the best answer we can give to the question, what is God, is, and this may surprise you, God is subsistent being itself. For Aquinas, it is God's very nature to exist, in that God is pure existence, not broken up into different ways of being. And, says Aquinas, God is the direct cause of the existence of things around which we can get our minds for as long as they exist, and not only when they begin to exist. God, Aquinas argues, is the non-temporal or timeless, and therefore unchangeable, source of the existence of the all-too-changeable spatio-temporal world, however far back in time that existed, and for however long it exists. In this sense, Aquinas turns out to be a kind of agnostic when it comes to God, but not in the modern sense of the term agnostic. Aquinas' general take on God differs from that of modern agnostics because while modern agnosticism says simply, we don't know, and the universe is a mysterious riddle, Aquinas says we do not know what the answer is, but we do know that there is a mystery behind it all which we do not know. And if there were not, there would not even be a riddle. This unknown we call God, and if there were no God, there would be no universe and nobody to be mystified. Now, of course, many people who believe in God speak in a quite different way from Aquinas. Typically, at least very often, they say that we do know what God is. God is a person. Or they say that God is an individual that exists alongside the universe as a center of consciousness of some kind. But Aquinas never, ever talks about God in that way. His view is that God is the creator of the universe, meaning that God accounts for there being something rather than absolutely nothing, meaning that God is the cause of there being anything whatsoever to pick out and understand. Hence, we find Aquinas denying that God is, in any familiar sense, a being. God's will, he says, in one place, this is not on your sheets, but here is a quote, at one point he says, God's will, which is identical with God, is to be thought of, he says, as existing outside the realm of existence, as a cause from which pours forth everything that exists in all its variant forms. For Aquinas, God is not a being among beings, and it is with thinking about God such as this in mind that Aquinas does not countenance the idea that God is a moral agent whose moral goodness one should try to defend by means of a theodicy. First of all, Aquinas does not think of God as a moral agent because he does not think of God as a member of a kind. Secondly, Aquinas does not think of God as a moral agent because of the ways in which he thinks of moral agents in general. Taking his lead from Aristotle, Aquinas takes moral agents to be human beings whose moral goodness consists in them having the classical cardinal virtues of justice and temperance and prudence and courage. These, for Aquinas, are the classical cardinal virtues. But, Aquinas thinks, these virtues are what people need in order to flourish as human beings. They are human virtues. So he does not think of God as having the classical cardinal virtues. Since he also takes virtues to be dispositions or tendencies when it comes to behavior, Aquinas does not think of God as being actually or possibly virtuous, because dispositions or tendencies play themselves out in time, while Aquinas holds that God is not temporal but eternal. For Aquinas, God has no dispositions, and in that sense, no virtues. Now, you might, of course, think that moral goodness can be displayed not just by people having the cardinal virtues, but also by people who do what they are duty-bound or obliged to do. You might think that the key concepts in thinking about ethics should be duty and obligation rather than virtue and vice. Yet, though the notions of duty and obligation enter into Aquinas' account of human moral goodness, Aquinas does not think of God as morally good, even in that sense of morally good. And that's because he does not think of God as working in a context in which he can be thought to have obligations or duties of any kind. For Aquinas, God is the maker of all contexts, the maker who has no role or job to live up to. To think otherwise, thinks Aquinas, would amount to being committed to idolatry, to failing to note that God is not a creature, not part of the spatio-temporal world. Now, if Aquinas is thinking along those lines, however, how can he possibly suppose that God is good? More precisely, what are his philosophical reasons for thinking that God is good? Now, I summarize his basic line of argument in quotation 2 on your sheets. So let's just look at that. This is the way he argues philosophically for the claim that there is goodness in God, and therefore, thinks Aquinas, that God is goodness itself. He argues, first, something good is always something desirable or attractive in some way. 2, hence, for example, if I want a good bicycle, then I want something that displays the perfections that a bike is supposed to have, considered as a bike, and not, say, as a weapon. So, if I am aiming to make a good bike, I aim to produce what I have in mind as a good bike, what I have in mind as a good bike. Then he argues, such a bike, if successfully produced by me, reflects what I have in mind for it even before making it. So, the bike I have made has its goodness with reference to my intentions as its maker. Then he argues, God is the ultimate maker as accounting for there being something rather than nothing. Then he argues, we can think of good things as achieving perfections intended by God. And he argues such good things are good because of these intentions, and their being good amounts to them arriving at what God is non-temporally intending when willing their goodness. So, he thinks, created good things show forth what is in God before it is in them. So, he thinks, goodness can be attributed to God as containing, so to speak, the blueprints for all good creatures. But then he reasons all that is in God is God, so God can be said to be good. Whether you like that line of reasoning or not, the basic idea is that assuming that you can't give what you don't have, Aquinas holds that creaturely goodness must somehow reflect what is in God. He doesn't think of God as containing creaturely goodness, as, say, a bottle contains water, nor does he think of God as exhibiting creaturely goodness as creatures do. His point is that goodness in creatures is a dim, and for Aquinas, a very dim reflection of what exists simply and undivided in the eternal God, since God is what is making creatures to exist, since they derive all that they are from God, or from the mind of God, or from what is in God, which has to be God. Yet, Aquinas does not say that evil reflects what God is. He thinks that goodness in things is somehow a reflection of God and is a reason for supposing that there is goodness in God. He doesn't make the same move when it comes to evil. And that's for two main reasons. The first is concerned with his, or connected with his understanding of the meaning of the word good. And the second has to do with his view of divine causality. Aquinas thinks of there being goodness as there being something actually there that we want to be there or look to find there. That's his basic take on good. He does not think of evil in that way. Look at quotation 3 on your sheets, where you find him saying this at one point. Like night from day, you learn about one opposite from the other. So you take good in order to grasp what evil means. And he goes on to say, we have accepted that the word good means whatever is desirable. Well then, since each real thing is drawn to its own existence and completion, we have to say that this fulfills the meaning of good in every case. Therefore, the word evil cannot signify a certain existing being or a real shaping or positive kind of thing. Consequently, we are left to infer that it signifies a certain absence of a good. In other words, Aquinas thinks that X is bad only and always means that X lacks some kind of goodness, that X's badness is a matter of absence or privation and not a matter of something existing as some kind of positive substance. Aquinas thinks, for example, that if we lament about somebody being blind, this is bad, we're focusing on the fact that they lack the ability to see. We're not celebrating the presence of something, we're bemoaning the absence of something. Again, Aquinas is thinking that if someone is morally bad, then that person is someone who lacks certain virtues. Now, you might suppose that that point of view commits Aquinas to the conclusion that evil is an illusion, or something that does not exist in any sense. But Aquinas certainly does not think that, nor does he bluntly deny that evil exists. His point is that many things are genuinely in a bad way, and he thinks that the sentence evil exists makes sense since it captures that fact. On the other hand, though, Aquinas does not think of evil as a substance or as a positive reality in a substance. He thinks that I am a substance, but he does not take evil to be a substance as I am. He thinks that I actually have hair of a certain color, but he does not think of my suffering from evil as a matter of having any such positive attribute. Aquinas thinks of evil in entirely negative terms, as what there is when we have a gap between what something is and what something needs to be so as to be good in some way. It's the gap between what something manages to be and what something ought to be or needs to be but isn't. So Aquinas holds that we do not know what God is, that God is no more a moral agent than my cat is, that God is good as being the unfathomable source of all creaturely goodness, and that evil is always a lack of goodness of some kind. That is what I've been trying to explain. So now then, what does Aquinas think of evil in the light of his belief that God is the creator of everything other than God. How does this notion of God as creator fit in with the account of God and evil that I've been summarizing for you? As I've said, Aquinas agrees that evil can be said to exist in some way. As I've also said, he holds that God is what makes the difference between there being something rather than nothing at all. So, is Aquinas not therefore committed to supposing that God somehow causes evil? Doesn't that follow from his account? In order to answer that question, I need to note that Aquinas distinguishes between two kinds of evil. There is, he says, both evil suffered and evil done. The Latin terms behind those English translations are malum pene and malum culpae, but I'll just now talk about evil suffered and evil done. Aquinas takes evil suffered to amount to evil that is not anybody's doing. So, for example, Aquinas would think of me as a victim of evil suffered if I become sick naturally and not by human malice. On the other hand, though, he thinks of evil done as definitely ascribable to people. So he would say that there is evil done when I choose to murder someone or wrongly abuse them in some way. And it's with respect to evil done and evil suffered that Aquinas discusses the question, how does God stand causally when it comes to evil? With regard to evil suffered, Aquinas' view is that this is caused by God, but only indirectly and never by being willed by God as an end in itself. As I've said, Aquinas maintains that as causally accounting for anything created, God is bringing it about that something exists. So, since Aquinas thinks that victims of evil suffered certainly exist, he takes it for granted that God is causally accounting for their being victims of evil suffered. Yet he does not think that the evil in evil suffered is any kind of substance. In keeping with his general account of evil, which I've sketched already this afternoon, Aquinas holds that there is evil suffered only insofar as something is lacking an appropriate good of some kind. For Aquinas, there is evil suffered only inasmuch as there is a lack of goodness, and Aquinas does not think that a lack of goodness is something creatable, causable by God as creator. So, Aquinas denies that the evil in evil suffered is creatively brought about by God. In this sense, Aquinas thinks of the evil in evil suffered as brought about by God only indirectly, not creatively. More precisely, Aquinas' view is that when there is evil suffered, this is always because there is some concomitant good that God is directly bringing about. So, for example, were he around today, he would say that my suffering from, say, malaria is due to the flourishing in my liver of certain mosquito-borne parasites. When I have malaria, these parasites are doing well at my expense. And, thinks Aquinas, this doing well is being created by God, since it exists and involves no privation of goodness in the parasites, causing me to suffer from malaria. In other words, Aquinas' view is that evil suffered always has a scientific explanation and is always to be accounted for in terms of one thing doing well at the expense of another, not to be accounted for in terms of God creating the evil of evil suffered, to be accounted for in terms of God creating the well-being of that which, by feeding on something else, brings about some effect which amounts to a lack of goodness in that thing. Actually, Aquinas' argument is that when it comes to evil suffered, God is causing nothing but what is good. Nothing but what is good. On the one hand, Aquinas thinks God is causing the goodness in what causes evil suffered, the goodness of the mosquito, let's say. On the other hand, Aquinas also thinks that God is causing what goodness there is in the victims of evil suffered. Aquinas is clear that victims of evil suffered are indeed in a bad way. At the same time, though, he argues that as long as these victims continue to exist, they possess goodness to some degree. His view is that even an ailing or sick human being has to exhibit the goodness required for there to be a human being, since even an ailing human being is still a human being with enough human goodness to leave it existing as a human being. But now, when it comes to evil done, a different story for Aquinas. And that's because he does not think that there is ever any concomitant good when it comes to evil done. At this point, I should perhaps note that Aquinas' approach to evil done is, as I might put it, entirely non-consequentialist. I mean, he thinks that there is evil done when someone makes morally bad choices or commits sin, but he does not think that one has to have brought about bad consequences in order to have made a morally bad choice. He is prepared to factor consequences of actions into an evaluation of people and would, for example, deem someone committing genocide to be morally worse than someone stealing a dollar bill. But he also holds that one can exhibit evil done, one can display evil done, that one can be morally bad even if one manages to have no bad effect in the world. Suppose that I make a smart bomb, and suppose that I put it in a place with the intention of blowing up a large chunk of Columbus. Okay. Now, also suppose that the bomb fails to explode as I intended it to do. Would the fact that I did not manage to kill people mean that I did not exhibit moral badness when planting the bomb? Well, Aquinas thinks not. For him, the evil in evil done is attributable to the agent who makes morally bad choices, not in what the agent manages to bring about. In that sense, his approach to evil done is not consequentialist. The effects, the bad effects of moral failure for Aquinas would just fall under the heading of evil suffered. Evil done is in the doer, not in the effects of the doer. So for Aquinas, the evil in evil done is only in the doer, and the bad consequences of evil done amount to evil suffered. But now, in that case, Aquinas concludes that evil done involves no concomitant good. You can't play the same trick as me and the mosquitoes when it comes to evil done. There's no concomitant good when it comes to evil done, according to Aquinas. He does not think that my evil actions are due to the action of something flourishing in its own way, as I display an absence of good. That's not the story here for him. For Aquinas, evil done is pure privation of goodness with no accompanying good to account for it or to absorb it, so to speak. If you like, it's a dead loss. So, Aquinas goes on to argue, evil done can't be thought of as something created by God. And with the case of evil suffered, Aquinas does not take the evil in evil done to be a created substance. So he does not take God as making it to have created being, making evil done to have created being. Evil done, the evil in evil done for Aquinas is just not something creatable. in this sense, is not caused by God. Remember, the topic here now is God's causal relation to evil. What Aquinas argues is that the evil in evil done only has a cause in the agent who displays the evil done, the evil in evil done. And he thinks that this agent causes, as it were, the evil of evil done only by failing to act as he or she ought to act. It's not that there might not be a lot of goodness involved in perpetrating something bad for Aquinas, but the evil in evil done for Aquinas is a dead loss and is simply due to a defect in the agent turning away from something that the agent ought to be doing in particular circumstances. For Aquinas, the only acting cause when I exhibit the evil of evil done is me not acting as I should. It lies in me paying attention to certain goods while turning my back on or ignoring other goods to which I ought to be attending. In effect, it lies in human freedom. But now, wouldn't you say, human free choices, aren't they as real as anything else? So, given what I've said, isn't Aquinas committed to supposing that God causes the evil in evil free choices? If evil free choices are real, God is the maker of all things, isn't God the cause of these things? Now, some would say that Aquinas is committed to supposing that God is in fact the cause of the evil in evil free choices, but Aquinas doesn't think that he is committed to that conclusion. Now I need to note what Aquinas has to say about two questions. The first is God a cause of sin? And the second question is, does the human action of sinning come from God? Now, Aquinas' answer to the first question is no. But his answer to the second question is yes. God can't be a cause of sin, says Aquinas, since it is not right to say that God causes sin in himself or another directly or even indirectly. But then he goes on to say what you find in 4 on your sheets. Look at the 4th quotation on your sheets. He says, sin is by definition a withdrawal from the order of things which has God as its purpose. For his part, God inclines all things and draws them to himself. Hence, he cannot withdraw either himself or another from an order of things which has itself as its center. So he cannot directly cause sin. Nor can God indirectly cause sin. It can happen that God withholds his help, and that without his help one falls into sin, but God ought not to be blamed when somebody sins, any more than a pilot should be blamed when a ship sinks, except in the case where the pilot could and should have been at the helm. Therefore, in no way whatsoever can God be called the cause of sin. Now that may sound curious, but let me try to summarize what's going on here. The idea seems to be that God is good, and therefore can't cause to exist what is intrinsically bad. God can't create evil as such. Aquinas also seems to be saying that though God might not make me to be a saint, obviously has not done that, God might not make me to be a saint, it's not his job to make me a saint. The captain of a ship has a job to do, but Aquinas can make no sense of the idea that God has a job to do as the captain of a ship. And the reason he can make no sense of this idea is because he does not think of God as a thing in the world, with a way of acting, rightly or wrongly, that's determined by the circumstances in which it happens to exist as a being among beings. Yet, Aquinas, as I've now said, also holds that the human act of sinning does come from God. He thinks that. Here's what he says. Look at 5 on your sheets, which should make sense in the light of what I've been saying so far, I hope. He says, the act of sin not only belongs to the realm of being, but it is also an act. And from both of these points of view, it comes from God. Every being, regardless of its manner of existence, must be derived from the first being. Every action is caused by something already in act, because moving another to act presupposes that the mover has the power to act. Every being which is in act depends on the first act, God, as to its cause. Therefore, insofar as the thing can be called an action, God is its cause. But sin can be called a being and an action only in the sense that something is missing. And this missing element comes from a created cause, that is, the free will in its departure from order to the first agent, who is God. Accordingly, this defect is not ascribed to God as its cause, but to the free will, even as the defect of limping is due to a crooked leg as its cause, but not to the motive power, which nevertheless causes whatever there is of movement in the limping. Accordingly, God is the cause of the act of sin, and yet he is not the cause of sin, because he does not cause the act to have a defect. Now, what Aquinas is saying there is that God is operative as creator even in our sinful actions. God, thinks Aquinas, may not be able to make evil to exist as a substance or positive reality, but he holds God acts in every operation, whether of nature or of will. Now, if that's the case, isn't Aquinas committed to a kind of theological determinism? I mean, to the view that God forces us to do all that we do so that we can never act freely, given the creative causality of God as making all things from nothing. Now, you may think that Aquinas is so committed, but he would not agree, for reasons that he gives in several places, including one of his commentaries on Aristotle. Look at quotation 6 on your sheets. In one of his commentaries on Aristotle, Aquinas cites this argument for discussion. If God's providence is the cause of everything that happens in the world, it seems that everything must happen the way it does. Firstly, because God knows it and his knowledge can't be mistaken, so what he knows must necessarily happen. And secondly, because he wills it, and his will can't be ineffective, so everything he wills, it seems, must necessarily happen. Now, what Aquinas has to say in response to that line of argument, I give you in the 7th quotation on your sheets. Look at this. He says, these objections depend, important point, depend on thinking of knowledge in God's mind and the working of God's will on the model of such activities in us, whereas they are in fact very different. What Aquinas argues is that when it comes to God's will, that can't be thought of as something imposing necessity on one thing, because God is not a spatio-temporal object coercing another spatio-temporal object alongside it. But when it comes to the question of God's activity, when it comes to human choosing, Aquinas has this to say. Look at 8 on your sheets. What can be said, what can be, and what must be are variants of being. So that it is from God's will itself that things derive whether they must be or may not be, and the distinction of the way of the two according to the nature of their immediate causes. For God prepares causes that must cause for those effects that he wills must be, and causes that might cause but might fail to cause for those effects that he wills might or might not be. And it is because of the nature of their causes that some effects are said to be effects that must be, and others effects that need not be, although all depend on God's will as primary cause, a cause which transcends this distinction between must and might not. Now, you might not make too much sense of that, confronted by it cold, but let me paraphrase what's going on in that passage. What Aquinas is saying, in a sense, is God makes no difference to anything, even though God accounts for changes that creatures undergo. Aquinas takes God to be the creator, and he takes that conclusion to mean that God accounts for there being something rather than nothing. But he recognizes that this conclusion commits him to the further conclusion that for God to create something is not for God to tinker with it, mess around with it, modify it. It's for God to make it to exist, to make it to be what it is. So Aquinas thinks that God creates something not by changing it. That's the force of my God makes no difference to anything. God creates something, Aquinas thinks, not by changing it, but by making it to exist from second to second, though not out of anything. And it's with that conclusion of Aquinas in mind that I say he thinks God makes no difference to anything. For Aquinas, God as creator makes the difference between there being something rather than nothing, not the difference in a thing between it being first like this and then like that, though he does think that God accounts for changes in created things. So he doesn't think of God's creative act as interfering with anything so as to render its behavior determined or necessary. That's his answer to the question, does God's creative action mess around with my freedom? He does not think of God's creative act as interfering, determining, necessitating anything. He thinks that God, the creator, makes things to be whatever they are. And he also thinks that some creatures are what they are of necessity, as when you force something to go in a certain direction, while others are not. In short, Aquinas' view is that though God is the source of our freedom, we are free not in spite of God, but because of God. And why does Aquinas think we have this freedom? Well, he has a number of arguments in different places for the conclusion that humans have freedom. Anyway, he maintains that humans certainly do have freedom, and that freedom is ascribable to us failing to act in certain ways. In the light of all of that, in the light of all I've been saying today, Aquinas makes no attempt to deal with the topic of God and evil by somehow defending God's moral goodness in terms of a theodicy. For him, God is way beyond that kind of defense. God is not an intelligible object subject to moral praise or moral blame. God is the inscrutable creator of the universe, who is the heart of the universe's existence, but in no way the direct cause of the sheer existence of evil in any form, although for Aquinas there is nothing to stop God making a whole lot more good than he has actually made. So, thank you very much.